Welcome everybody to the Out of Home Insider Show, a podcast like no other, hosted by the one and only Tim Rowe. Get ready to have some knowledge dropped on you and to be entertained, because nothing's more valuable than food for your brain. So sit back, relax, we're about to dive in as the best industry podcast is about to begin.
Welcome back to another episode of Out of Home Insider. In case you missed it, look back, check last week's episode. It was all about content adjacency. How can we solve for the content challenge of digital out of home in the CTV conversation? Looking ahead to next week, we're going to do a full deep dive on news and topics that are adjacent to digital out of home, get you set up for 2025. But today's conversation is with Chris Kane, Jounce Media, and we're going to be talking all about SPO, supply path optimization, OpenRTB, the digital out of home networks that are winning disproportionately to others. Why? Why is that the case? Chris Kane, thanks so much for being here.
Great to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Absolutely. So maybe we just start high level. What is SPO? Why does it matter?
Sure. SPO is my simplified version of supply path optimization is that it is a whole host of techniques and initiatives that buyers are implementing to make really deliberate choices about which RTB auctions they submit bids to and which RTB auctions they choose to sit on the sidelines. And there's a whole bunch of motivating factors behind it. But the big picture is you can create better return on your marketing investment if you are making very thoughtful choices about which auctions you want to participate in.
Makes sense. Thank you for the explanation and setting the table for us. One of the big challenges, I think, with digital out of home, and your research highlights it, is the ambiguity of digital out of home. It's not quite classic out of home. It's also not quite CTV, which is largely it's a big screen TV. It's a large format connected TV adjacent to professionally produced content. Why is that such a challenge for digital out of home?
Well, I think I will get there very quickly, but this is a much broader thing that exists across the whole supply landscape. There's such fragmentation of RTB traded supply that it's just really, really hard for buyers to wrap their arms around kind of like a human level understanding of what they're buying, which, by the way, is not the case in all digital media. Like, I think people have a pretty good handle on like what the Instagram experience is. It's just so gigantic. Like, you can spend your time as a media buyer to like get some basic familiarity with like, what is that ad product? You just can't do that on the open internet. You just can't do that with the whole breadth of web supply, mobile app supply, CTV supply. And it's also really hard to communicate these sort of like subtle but important differences through RTB auctions. There's just a lot of nuance that is very hard to stuff into some, JSON blob that gets sent from a SSP to a DSP. And so anyway, to then get to your question, among many other categories of supply, there is this large and growing pool of inventory that is not classically CTV supply and is also not classically digital out-of-home supply. Marketers are spending a material amount of money on that today. They are spending more and more over time. And it's just not clear at all to me, or I think to the whole ad tech world, what is the right way for the buyer and for the seller to treat request auctions for an out-of-home connected TV screen. What do you do with that? What budgets should be eligible for those auctions and what budgets should not be eligible for those auctions?
Those are hard decisions, and I'm sure every organization's approaching it differently, which as an industry kind of makes it hard to solve for. But I thought your research, it pointed out something that I don't know that a lot of digital out-of-home folks know. Where's the majority of the OpenRTB digital out-of-home demand? Where's it actually coming from?
Well, man, there's like a bunch of ways that you come at this. If you're trying to size the demand, you could think of this by sort of like buying platform. Maybe that's the easiest way to start.
Okay.
And so in that framing, basically all the money, 75% of the money lives in Google, the Trade Desk, and Amazon. Like that's 75% of DSP money lives behind those platforms.
Okay.
There's lots of other platforms beyond that. Some are managing more than $1 billion a year, but we're talking about such a giant market that like basically there's 3 bidding platforms that really move the market. And then within each of those bidding systems, Google Ads, DV360, Trade Desk, Amazon DSP. Within each of them, then you get tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of advertisers who are configuring campaigns in lots of different ways to buy different cross sections of supply. And so you'd have like a web retargeting campaign or a mobile app install campaign or a CTV awareness campaign. And somewhere in there, you can also buy digital out-of-home supply. Sometimes you can buy digital out-of-home supply because you configured a campaign to buy digital out-of-home supply. There are also situations in which you set up a campaign to target connected TV supply and you buy out-of-home screens. And there's like a pretty reasonable and active debate at the moment of like, is that last thing that I said a problem or is that a feature?
What do you think?
I think it's a very reasonable debate. I've spent some time thinking about this. A lot of people have spent time thinking about this. I think reasonable people come down on different sides of that debate.
How, not that we're going to answer it in this conversation, but how do you start to think about solving for such a disparate conversation? Two very different sides of the equation. How do you, any advice for us as an industry?
You know, the impractical but sort of like easy answer is buyer choice. You know, like if we're talking about a connected TV screen in a bar or in an airport or in a dentist's office, you know, there's a very reasonable, but I think totally impractical argument that says like, give buyers choice, let buyers make that decision. And it's like the last thing a DSP buyer needs is more decisions to make.
Sure.
You know, like that's just, yeah, sure. There will be some like a handful of super sophisticated media buying teams who decide that it's worth their while to like build a deep understanding of these large pools of out-of-home screens. But that's not the market. You know, the market is tens of thousands to millions of less sophisticated buyers who sort of think of it, this is the DSP's job. Like, this is what I'm paying my DSP to do. They got to abstract away all of these sort of like nuanced, esoteric decisions and like just like do the right thing. And so DSP's got to make the judgment call. You know, like there's a product person at Trade Desk, there's a product person at Google Ads, there's a product person at Amazon DSP who's like making the call. Like, what's the default? How are we going to handle inbound auctions for a connected TV screen owned by a company that deploys these connected TV screens in out-of-home places? It's like some guy, some woman made it just like a judgment call. And they probably didn't make the same judgment call at those different major DSPs. But the default behavior of the DSP is what matters.
Really interesting. The networks that are winning disproportionately to the industry, what are they doing differently?
Well, so we wrote, very brief context, we're in the research business. We write a bunch of research and we sell it as a subscription. Every month we publish a research report. There was a report we published earlier this year that tried to like really wrestle with the issues you and I are talking about. And in that report, the main thing that we highlighted is this ambiguity of like, you know, should a connected TV campaign buy an out-of-home screen is not relevant for very large portions of digital out-of-home supply. And so just like to speak in specifics, like this is not a consideration that is relevant for Clear Channel Outdoor. This is not a consideration that's relevant for gas station TV and many, many others. And the reason those two companies and dozens of others that are like them, the reason this is not relevant is they only sell their inventory, as far as I can tell, through these sort of like digital out-of-home specialized SSPs, Vistar, Place Exchange, Broadsign, Hivestack. And because of that, DSPs just treat all that supply as out-of-home. And you wouldn't sort of like, it wouldn't be like logistically possible to commingle that supply with a CTV campaign because it's coming through unique sets of SSP pipes that the DSP kind of knows or is instructed to treat as digital out-of-home.
Like pre-filtered.
Right. Like when most DSPs built their integration with Place Exchange, like the product manager at the DSP who was like pushing the buttons to set the defaults, like, oh, we'll call this, like this pipe only feeds us digital out-of-home supply. So like just make it available to digital out-of-home campaigns. And like,
got it.
I think that's appropriate and reasonable. The thing that is nuanced that you were driving at is there are other screen owners who work with the classic digital out-of-home SSPs and also work with the omnichannel SSPs. They'll also run auctions through Magnite or Xandr or a bunch of others. And that's where this ambiguity exists, because I've got these inbound requests coming from, an omni-channel SSP for a large format screen. It's declaring information, thinking about like your podcast last week about the content that's on screen, because there is content that's on screen. It's like,
right.
It's just described to the DSP in a way that looks exactly like CTV supply and arguably is CTV supply. And then there are some DSPs who've said like, okay, when the inbound request that looks like this comes from Pluto TV, call it CTV. When the inbound request comes from some other company that we think is a screen, that we've made a judgment call, is not the same as CTV, route it to the digital out-of-home campaigns. But so anyway, that's where this ambiguity exists. And to then finally get to your question, the companies that only work with digital out-of-home SSPs are kind of irrelevant for this conversation. And also, as a little bit of by the way, issue a very small number of bid requests to DSPs. But there are other out-of-home screen owners who will partner with all the incumbent SSPs for digital out-of-home and all the omni-channel SSPs. And this gets like pretty deep into ad tech details, will also work with a bunch of ad networks who then resell through the classic SSPs. And so for one available ad opportunity on an out-of-home screen, a DSP might receive 2 or 3 bid requests from, let's say, Clear Channel, but 40 bid requests from another screen owner. And so the availability of supply gets totally swamped by a handful of companies that are issuing lots of duplicate auctions. I don't view that as a bad thing at all. This is like very much the normal way of operating in the web, mobile app, and CTV categories. It's not the normal way of operating, though, in the digital out-of-home space. And so it's a relatively small number of companies, 4 or 5 companies, represent just like the giant majority of out-of-home supply that's available to DSPs.
Wrapped up in that bid duplication, how is that a part of the equation? Is that what's happening?
It's an availability bias thing. We call it.
Okay.
Yeah. There's this thing that we've been studying for a long time that we call volume bias, essentially availability bias. If you had just like play like a ridiculous example with me, early days of header bidding on the web is when this started to become relevant. If you had a web publisher who did not have header bidding, they would make, simplifying some details, each time they had an ad available, they would send one bid request, one auction to a DSP. If you had another publisher that got like they moved real fast and adopted header bidding through all of the sophisticated ways, when one ad was available on that website, a DSP might receive 10 bid requests from 10 different SSPs. And so what winds up happening, I used the word swamped before, like that first publisher gets swamped by the second publisher. And just like there are many more bites at the apple that second publisher can take to just like get back a bid from a DSP. And so what winds up happening is, because the bid stream gets kind of distorted when one publisher is creating duplicate auctions and another publisher is not, DSP participation and therefore spend winds up shifting to the publisher that runs lots of duplicate auctions. This is relevant in a bunch of ways, but like basically for the purpose of spend allocation, this is immaterial on the web, in mobile app, even in the CTV space, because everyone does it. Like this is the norm. I don't know if it's the norm for your audience, who I know is a very out-of-home oriented audience, but like this is like business as usual for many, many years on web, mobile app, and CTV. Every web publisher, every mobile app developer, every streaming service now runs tons of duplicate auctions through tons of SSPs. And that's problematic in a handful of ways, but at least everyone is like approximately equally represented in the bid stream. And so you don't get this like weird distortion of DSP spend. But in the digital out-of-home space, this whole thing that we're talking about auction duplication is not normal. It's not good or bad. It's just not common, And so like 40 of the top 50 screen owners just like don't do this thing. They don't run tons of duplicate auctions for each impression, but like 8 or 10 of them do. And so you get 8 or 10 screen owners that represent like 90% of the bid stream, not because they're 90% of available supply, just because they're creating tons of auction duplication like CTV companies do and mobile app developers do and web publishers do.
If I can reframe it for the out-of-home audience that's coming into the programmatic conversation, they're just available in more stores. Is that a fair way to sum it up? You can buy them from more places.
Yeah, the shelves are stocked with supply from a handful of companies. And like you can get supply from other digital out-of-home screen owners, but it's like on a small shelf in the back of the store.
So how then, maybe there's digital out-of-home publishers listening to this now. How should they be thinking about programmatic? Maybe they haven't plugged in any supply yet, or maybe they are a little further down that roadmap. How should they be thinking about which platforms to plug in? Do I plug into all of them? How should I think about my inventory relative to this conversation?
It's a hard question. I mean, I think it's really important for me to just sort of overstate that I don't feel like I really understand the out-of-home space. I really understand the DSP category, but I don't really think I understand the digital out-of-home space. And I don't have a good handle on how important DSP demand is to digital out-of-home screen owners. Further, everything that we're talking about, I think, is completely irrelevant for media company screen owners who source DSP demand through one-to-one private marketplaces. Like if you're in the business, if your programmatic monetization strategy is go bang the doors at the big agencies, sell one-to-one private marketplaces, and have that executed through RTB auctions, everything that I just said is completely irrelevant to your business.
Sure.
But if you care about discretionary spend, basically open auction demand, now this stuff matters a lot. And you will not get anywhere close to your fair share of discretionary spend, open auction demand, if you are not making your supply highly available. And what that means, unfortunately, is running around the industry and signing literally dozens of partnerships with all of the major SSPs across the digital out-of-home category and the omnichannel category, and probably also signing partnerships with ad networks who will run even more duplicate auctions through reselling SSPs. That has become what's normal in all these other environments. And I think that has a real chance of becoming what's normal in the digital out-of-home space. I don't love that for what it's worth, but that seems to be the direction that, market forces are going to tug screen owners.
Just say, I want to maybe double click into that. You said you don't love it. What don't you love about it? And do you have obviously the market is the market, but in a perfect world, how should it work?
Well, there's two things not to love about that setup. There's at least two things not to love about that setup. One is it really crushes the unit economics of DSPs and SSPs. Like for media companies, working with, whether you work with a single SSP or a dozen SSPs does not change your operating costs. I mean, maybe it creates a little bit of like operational overhead for you, but like it doesn't cost you any money to run an auction through an SSP.
Sure.
But it costs that SSP money, like they got to pay for all of like the server activity and the associated energy that goes along with running that auction. And it costs the DSP money to receive that bid request and evaluate whether they should bid. And so you wind up creating lots of operating expense for SSPs and DSPs that does not unlock any new access to inventory. You're just sort of driving up the operating costs of these ad tech companies. And that just makes it very hard for ad tech companies to have, viable economics. So that's not a thing that screen owners should probably spend much of their time worrying about, but it's something that I spend my time thinking about. And has some, I think, pretty profound effects or impacts for like the durability of independent ad tech. That's like a big deal in my world. The other one, which is maybe more relevant for your audience, this is not great for the overall economics of screen owners, particularly when you work with ad networks that solicit DSP demand through reselling. Or to say that differently, what I'm going to say will not happen, which is a hypothetical. If every publisher in the world, web, mobile app, CTV, digital out-of-home, held hands and said, we are going to sell our supply through a single SSP. You can choose which SSP you want, but you get to pick one. In that future world, the same amount of money would leave DSPs, and more of that money would get paid to publishers. Like the publisher world would collect more money if the supply chain worked like that. The publisher world makes less money when publishers choose to run auctions through high-fee SSPs or multi-hop reselling supply chains who take a big ad tech cut. But each individual media company is rewarded for defecting. And so everybody eventually defects. And so the market's the market. This is where it's pulling us all. But those are probably the two big reasons why I don't like it.
I think that those are good reasons to not like it. The unit economics was not something that I'd consider, but stated so simply, I don't know how anyone could argue with that. We all want to make more money, and the brands want to put more of their money towards, obviously, operating media spend that's working for them in the market. I don't know that we will solve for that, but I appreciate the perspective and you being willing to share it. A question that I had, you mentioned ad networks and that being commonplace on the web. Can you give us an example how that works and how you see it, how it's working for digital out-of-home networks? Could you explain that?
Sure, yeah. I mean, so, like a screen owner gets approached by a company who says, we think we can bring you incremental demand. And you're like, well, what are you? And they're like, well, we're not an SSP, but we sell very large campaigns to advertisers. And, we currently work with the biggest advertisers and we work with all of your peers. And we'd like to include your supply when we sell these big campaigns to the biggest advertisers. It's like, okay, like that sounds fine. And to some degree, everything that I said is true. And in some cases, it's entirely true. But so what winds up happening is, a media company, digital out-of-home screen owner, builds this sort of technical integration. It's a relatively simplistic thing. You essentially traffic an ad tag from this ad network in your ad server. And whether it's for every impression or some subset of available ad spots, you give this ad network the opportunity to buy it from you. And often they do buy it. But the way that they buy it is they receive this request from the screen owner. They then initiate a whole bunch of RTB auctions through SSPs. Those SSPs send bid requests to DSPs, and DSPs bid back. Sometimes DSPs bid back because this ad network sold a campaign, private marketplace, to a marketer in that DSP. Sometimes those DSPs bid back because they've got a marketer who wants to participate in the open auction. The ad network's never heard of this company, but they found a willing buyer and they can create liquidity and facilitate that trade. And I think, in both of those situations, this is money that the media owner might not be able to get on its own. And so I think it's a perfectly reasonable choice for the media company. There's two watch-outs. One is there's a dilution of ad spend. If a marketer spends $1 through this sort of supply chain where like the DSP pays an SSP, who pays the ad network, who pays the digital out-of-home screen owner. If the marketer pays $1, maybe the screen owner gets 50 cents, and they potentially could have gotten more than that if they had sold this through a more direct supply chain. That's one consideration. The other is back to the beginning of our conversation. Some of these ad networks are really in the CTV business. And when they sell campaigns to brands and agencies, they have a slide deck that has a whole bunch of living room experiences in the slide deck. And they make either an implicit or sometimes an explicit statement that says you are buying living room supply. That's not to say that digital out-of-home supply is worth less than that. It's just not the same product.
Just not the same.
And they wind up blending in digital out-of-home supply or these out-of-home screens in a way that feels like a bait and switch to the marketer.
It feels very icky to not be having the transparent conversations about what it is. So I think conversations like this are essential to it. Chris Kane, what is the question that I haven't asked yet that I should have asked?
Well, I think I thought you were about to ask it. I think that is pretty icky. And if I'm a screen owner, it's sort of like, I don't know how to ask the question. I'll just answer the question. I think it's sort of like you're damned if you do and damned if you don't, if you're a screen owner. It's like, man, if I get approached by a CTV ad network to sell my out-of-home screens and I say yes, I'm now part of this like icky thing.
Sure.
If I say no, I've now just ceded market share to my competitors that I know are working with that company. And it's like you lose on both sides. And I don't know what the answer is, but I think this is probably an important thing for every digital out-of-home screen owner to kind of wrestle with. And at least not drift into a non-decision, like make an explicit call, have a management team meeting, grapple with this, make a decision and live with it. But I think a lot of digital out-of-home screen owners may not even realize this is an important choice to make. And then they wind up accidentally drifting into the choice of participating in a certain part of the supply chain that they actually aren't comfortable with, or on the other side, leaving money on the table that they will regret in the future.
Great perspective. Thank you for sharing that and adding it. Chris, we're going to be right back with a little bit of news. Before we get there, give folks the Latin long. That's what we use for Real World. Give them the Latin long. Where do they learn more about Jounce and maybe get their hands on this research?
JounceMedia.com is our website. We provide a handful of free resources that I think your audience might find useful. We do not provide free access to the report we've been talking about. That's part of our paid subscription service. But the free resources are good. You should start there.
Excellent. And the paid resources are well worth it. Chris will be right back with a little bit of news. Don't go anywhere. Great. Hey, would you like to measure your digital out-of-home campaigns just like everything else that you do? Measure things like web lift, conversion, foot traffic, ROAS, all in one place? If so, I'm going to encourage you to check out Accretive Outcomes. Because with Accretive, you'll be able to understand which formats and markets are working the hardest for your ad dollar. And beyond that, you'll be able to retarget the exposed audiences across premium CTV inventory with direct mail, even with email. It's a complete solution for brands and publishers, so check it out at accretiveads.com. Now, back to the show. Welcome back. Staying on the topic of video. 2 pieces this week out of eMarketer. The first about commerce video driving retail growth. Thought this was interesting. Obviously, more advertisers shifting towards video formats that are designed to convert attention. 40% of the open web, I believe, is unaddressable now. It's going to be 70% by 2026. So it's more and more important to be able to determine which tactics are carrying water. But 70% of advertisers are choosing the format. 95% are saying it drives more sales. Yet 3/4 of consumers are still annoyed by these ads. Chris, is it good? Is it bad? Or are people just always going to be annoyed by ads and brands just have to do what they have to do to make money?
Details matter a lot, right? But I think, there's consumers will always prefer an ad-free media experience. And I don't think it's realistic to sort of think that your ads are going to delight consumers. I think that's things people like to say at conferences. Ads are interruptive. Ads at work are interruptive.
That's right.
And that's just what it is. If this, whatever the media type is, if it drives sales, you should spend more money on it. If it doesn't drive sales, you shouldn't spend more money on it, as long as you have a basic human level understanding of what the ad experience is and, feel like it aligns with like some basic brand standards.
Dovetails nicely into the retail media piece from eMarketer, that most advertisers measure retail media success through performance metrics, ROAS, conversion, sales. As digital out of home and CTV have their own kind of measurement challenges, Chris, how do you think that we solve for this as the world gets less and less addressable? Does it just become about how many dollars did I spend and here's how much I made? Or is it DCRs? What do you think actually solves the challenge of addressability and the demand for outcome-based measurement?
I mean, I'm sincerely worried about this thing in like a very macro sense. There is a growing amount of marketing investment that has some provable return on real world business outcomes, and a shrinking share of spend that is, tasked with sort of like rather loose goals like reach and so on. Because the CFO is not going to tolerate the stuff that can't get proven. Right. Or to say it differently, like when budgets get cut, like they did during COVID, you're going to cut the thing that you have the lowest confidence performs. And if there's one thing the walled gardens have done well, it has built confidence. It is building confidence with marketers that $1 in creates more than $1 out. And the open internet has done an absolutely miserable job of this. And so, that's true for many segments of non-walled garden media, including, I would argue, digital out of home, although, again, I don't know that area as well. Certainly that's true on the web. Certainly that's true for large portions of connected TV. And, there are many if we've learned something from Apple's app tracking transparency and the way that Meta responded to it, it's that you can successfully convince marketers that $1 in is worth more than $1 out, even when you don't have a deterministic link between the ad and the sale. And we got to figure this out if non-walled garden digital media is going to, continue to capture budgets and return to growth.
Couldn't think of a better place to end it. Chris, can't thank you enough. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing as much as you have. See everybody next week. Thanks, Chris.